a towering loneliness. The wind howled against the craggy cliffs, a sound that could have been mistaken for the mournful cry of a distant beast. Towering above the jagged shoreline stood the lighthouse, a solitary sentinel carved out of stone and salt. Its beam cut through the thick, rolling fog, a single piercing eye in a world consumed by gray. Beneath its unwavering gaze, the sea churned, indifferent and endless. Inside the lighthouse, Elara Vaughn sat hunched over a battered wooden table, her fingers tracing the faint etchings carved into its surface by her predecessor. Words of warning, fragments of despair, remnants of lives lived in isolation. Her world had narrowed to this structure, this island, and the relentless rhythm of waves. Elara had been appointed keeper 6 months ago, her contract binding her to 3 years of solitude in exchange for the promise of land and financial freedom. The isolation had not been a deterrent. In truth, it had been the draw. She had fled a life she no longer recognized, one filled with broken relationships and whispered accusations. The lighthouse offered an escape, its remoteness a sanctuary. Yet as the months dragged on, the vast emptiness of her surroundings began to feel less like freedom and more like a cage. Elara's only regular company was the logbook, a heavy tome she was required to maintain. Every morning and evening, she meticulously recorded the weather, the condition of the light, and any unusual occurrences. Today's entry was as mundane as the rest. Fog persists. Wind from the northwest. No vessels sighted. A faint knock startled her, the sound alien against the familiar groans of the lighthouse. For a moment, she thought it a trick of the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, reverberating through the thick oak door. Elara's pulse quickened. No one came to the lighthouse. The nearest port was over 10 miles away, and the surrounding waters were treacherous even in fair weather. She stood, her chair scraping against the stone floor, and reached for the heavy iron key hanging from her belt. The door creaked open to reveal a man, bedraggled and soaked to the bone. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion, yet there was a fire in them that made her pause. He carried no belongings save for a small, leather-bound book clutched tightly in his hand. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I need shelter." Elara hesitated. The lighthouse was not meant to be a refuge, and she had been given strict instructions to avoid unnecessary interactions. But the man swayed on his feet, his body trembling against the cold. She stepped aside. "Come in." The man stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. Elara quickly bolted the door against the storm and fetched a blanket from the small cot in the corner. She draped it over his shoulders and moved to stoke the fire, her mind racing with questions. "Who are you?" she asked once the flames had grown strong enough to push back the chill. He hesitated, as if weighing the cost of truth. "Nathaniel Whitlock," he said finally, his voice rough. "I was on a ship, the Erebus. We hit the rocks last night. I think I'm the only one who made it." Elara's breath caught. Shipwrecks were not uncommon in these waters, but survivors were rare. The currents were unforgiving, the reefs a death trap for even the most experienced sailors. "How did you get here?" she pressed. Nathaniel glanced down at the book in his hands, his grip tightening. "The tide carried me. Or perhaps something else did." His gaze met hers, and for a moment, she saw something dark and unspoken flicker in his eyes. "I can't explain it." Elara decided not to press further, at least not yet. Instead, she busied herself preparing a meal from her meager stores. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that Nathaniel's arrival was more than mere chance. The lighthouse had stood alone for decades, its purpose solely to warn others away. Yet here he was, a man who had defied the odds to reach its shores. Over the next few hours, Nathaniel regained some of his strength. He spoke sparingly, offering only fragments of his story. The Erebus had been a merchant vessel, its crew seasoned, but its captain reckless. They had ventured too close to the rocks, lured by the promise of a shortcut through the straits. The storm had done the rest. "What's in the book?" Elara asked as they sat by the fire that evening. She had noticed how he kept it close, his fingers brushing its worn cover, as if it held some great secret. Nathaniel hesitated. "It's a journal," he said finally. "Belonged to the captain. I found it floating in the wreckage." "What does it say?" His expression darkened. "Not much that makes sense. Coordinates, cryptic notes, ramblings about a shadow in the water." Alara frowned. "A shadow?" Nathaniel nodded. "He wrote that it followed the ship for days, always just out of sight. The crew dismissed it as nonsense, but the captain became obsessed. He thought it was trying to lead them somewhere." A chill ran down Alara's spine, though she told herself it was the draft seeping through the stone walls. She had heard stories of strange happenings at sea, phantom lights, ghost ships, but they were always told as cautionary tales, their details exaggerated by years of retelling. "Do you believe him?" she asked. Nathaniel stared into the fire, his jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I do know this. The shadow didn't vanish with the storm. It's still out there." Alara wanted to dismiss his words as the ravings of a man traumatized by loss. But as the night wore on, and the lighthouse beam continued its tireless sweep across the waves, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. When she finally retired to her cot, she found sleep elusive. Nathaniel's words played over and over in her mind, intertwining with her own fears and memories. By the time dawn broke, she was no closer to answers, only a deepening sense of unease. The logbook lay open on the table, waiting for her daily entry. She picked up her pen and hesitated before writing. Fog persists. Wind from the northwest. Unusual occurrence. A survivor. She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "The sea feels different today." Building the bridge. The river stretched wide, its waters surging with the restless momentum of spring's thaw. On its farthest bank, the dense woodland loomed, holding the promise of safety. On this side, the world burned. Anna crouched behind a crumbling wall, her knuckles white around the hilt of her blade. The acrid stench of smoke filled her lungs, and the distant cries of survivors echoed over the flames. Beside her, Jarek tightened the straps of his leather armor, his eyes fixed on the half-constructed bridge that jutted precariously over the water. "We'll never make it in time," Anna whispered, her voice brittle. Jarek glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We have to try. If they finish it, we lose everything." The bridge was the last hope for the people of Rivermarch. It was their escape route, their lifeline. But it was also their enemy's greatest weapon. The Iron Vanguard, merciless soldiers sworn to the tyrant Lothar, had claimed the town 3 days ago, forcing the villagers to work without rest. With every plank hammered into place, the Vanguard's hold on the region tightened. A soft rustle behind them made Anna whirl, her blade poised. A boy no older than 10 emerged from the shadows, his soot-streaked face pinched with fear. "I found it," he said, holding up a charred map. "The explosives are under the east side." Jarek took the map and scanned it quickly. His jaw tightened. "Good work, Tomas. Now go back to the others and stay hidden." The boy hesitated, his wide eyes flicking to Anna. "Be careful." Anna nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "Always." As Tomas disappeared into the rubble, Anna turned back to Jarek. "East side. That's crawling with guards." Jarek folded the map and tucked it into his belt. "Then we'll have to be quiet." They moved like shadows through the wreckage, their steps careful and deliberate. The closer they got to the bridge, the louder the sounds of construction became. Hammers striking metal, chains clinking as beams were hoisted into place. Anna's heart pounded with each step. The plan was simple. Destroy the bridge before the Vanguard could use it to bring reinforcements. But simple didn't mean easy. At the edge of the construction site, Jarek motioned for Anna to stop. He pointed to a cluster of crates stacked near the water's edge. "The explosives are likely in those." Anna nodded. "Cover me?" She slipped from their hiding place, darting between piles of debris. Her pulse roared in her ears as she reached the crates. She crouched low, her hands working quickly to untie the ropes binding them together. A shout rang out, sharp and sudden. Anna froze. "Hey, over there!" She spun around to see a guard pointing in her direction. Before she could react, an arrow whizzed past her and struck the man square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, and Anna looked up to see Jarek lowering his bow. "Move," he barked. Anna yanked the last of the ropes free, revealing a cache of powder kegs. She grabbed a length of fuse and began rigging it to the barrels, her hands trembling. Behind her, the sound of boots on gravel grew louder. "Jarek, they're coming! I see them!" he shouted, loosing another arrow. Anna lit the fuse and bolted back toward their hiding spot. The explosion ripped through the air a moment later, a deafening roar that sent shockwaves through the ground. The bridge's eastern support collapsed in a shower of splinters and smoke. The vanguard scrambled to contain the damage, their shouts of confusion and anger filling the night. Jarek grabbed Anna's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We're not done yet." The western side. A sudden blow sent Jarek sprawling. Anna whirled to see a hulking vanguard soldier, his mace raised for another strike. She ducked under the swing and slashed at his leg, her blade biting deep into flesh. The man roared in pain, but didn't falter. "Jarek!" she shouted, but he was struggling to get up, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The soldier raised his mace again, but before he could bring it down, a blur of motion tackled him from the side. Tomas, clutching a rusted dagger, plunged the blade into the man's neck. The soldier gurgled and fell, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Tomas!" Anna cried, pulling the boy away from the body. "I couldn't stay hidden," he said, his voice trembling. "You needed help?" Jarek staggered to his feet, his gaze shifting between Anna and Tomas. "We need to move. Now." The western side of the bridge was less fortified, but time was running out. The vanguard would regroup soon, and reinforcements were likely on their way. As they approached the final support, Anna's stomach sank. A line of soldiers stood guard, their weapons gleaming in the firelight. Jarek cursed under his breath. "We can't fight them all." Anna glanced at Tomas, then at the ruins around them. Her mind raced. "We don't have to." "Jarek, can you create a distraction?" He frowned but nodded. "What are you planning?" Anna didn't answer. She handed Tomas her blade. "Stay close to Jarek. Protect each other." "Anna, wait." Jarek started, but she was already moving. She ran straight toward the guards, her heart hammering. "Over here!" she shouted, waving her arms. The soldiers turned, their eyes narrowing. Anna ducked as a spear hurtled past her, then veered toward a pile of barrels. "Get her!" one of the soldiers barked. Anna skidded to a stop and grabbed a torch from the ground. With a swift motion, she shoved it into the nearest barrel. The flames caught instantly, the heat searing her skin. She turned and ran as the barrels exploded, the force of the blast knocking her off her feet. When she looked up, the western support was gone, the bridge collapsing into the river in a cascade of wood and fire. Jarek and Tomas appeared at her side, helping her to stand. "You're insane," Jarek said, his tone a mix of relief and anger. Anna managed a weak smile. "It worked, didn't it?" In the distance, the vanguard's camp descended into chaos. The bridge was gone, and with it, their path to reinforcements. For now, River March had a fighting chance. Anna looked at Jarek and Tomas, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over. Not yet. But tonight they had won. The bridge to her heart. The rain began as a gentle mist, softening the edges of the world. It blurred the rigid lines of the cobblestone bridge that stretched over the churning river below, but nothing could obscure the figure standing at its center. Lila Sinclair adjusted the hood of her cloak, the worn fabric barely keeping the damp at bay, and peered through the gloom. She wasn't alone anymore. Opposite her, a man stood with shoulders squared and hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. His stance was tense, almost defiant, but his face, illuminated briefly by the flicker of a distant lantern, carried an ache that matched her own. Ethan Ward. The name alone sent ripples through her, dredging up a dozen memories she'd spent years burying. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she called out, her voice steady despite the tumult in her chest. He took a step forward, the soles of his boots scraping against the wet stones. "I came because I need answers, Lila. And I think you do too." Lila's hands tightened around the strap of her satchel. She had hoped to make this journey in solitude, to cross the bridge and leave behind the tangled mess of her past. But the past, it seemed, had found her first. "I told you. There's nothing left to say," she replied, her words colder than she intended. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't retreat. "Then why are you running? You think crossing this bridge will change anything? That it'll make what happened disappear?" The accusation struck deep, but Lila refused to flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You don't know what I'm doing, Ethan. You don't know what I've lost. And you think I haven't lost anything?" His voice rose, raw and unguarded. "You're not the only one who loved her, Lila. You're not the only one who's haunted by what happened that night." The name hung between them, unspoken but suffocating. Maeve. For a moment, the sound of the river below swallowed their silence. Lila turned her gaze to the water, its surface a mirror of her own turmoil. Maeve had been her sister, her light, and losing her had shattered more than just their family. It had torn through friendships, through love, and left behind wounds that time refused to heal. "You don't get to do this," Lila whispered. "You don't get to stand here and pretend we're the same. You don't know what it was like to find her, to see." Her voice broke, and she pulled the satchel closer, as though its weight could anchor her. Ethan's expression softened, the fire in his eyes dimming to something mournful. "You're right. I don't know what it was like for you, but I do know what it's like to carry the blame, to wonder if I could have done something, anything to change it." Lila shook her head, her grip on the satchel tightening. "Blame? That's rich. Coming from you. You were supposed to look out for her, Ethan. You promised me you'd keep her safe. And I failed," he said, the words cutting through the rain like a blade. "I've lived with that every day, Lila. But running from it hasn't made it any easier. And it won't for you either." The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly beneath them, a liminal space where the weight of the past pressed down on every breath. Lila looked at Ethan, searching for the anger she wanted to feel, but finding only the same grief that had been her companion for so long. "I'm not running," she said at last, her voice quieter now. "I'm looking for something that might help me understand why she's gone." Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the satchel. "Before Maeve, before that night, she gave me this." She opened the bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were worn, their edges frayed, but the sight of it made Ethan's breath catch. "Her journal," he murmured. Lila nodded. "I didn't read it at first. I couldn't. But now, I think she was trying to tell me something, Ethan. Something I missed." He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the journal, as though it held the answers to every question he'd ever asked. "What does it say?" "I don't know yet," Lila admitted. "Not all of it, but there's a name that keeps coming up. A place, too. Ravenswood. Do you know it?" Ethan's face darkened, his gaze shifting toward the distant horizon. "I know it. It's a small town on the other side of the river. But it's not the kind of place you go looking for closure, Lila. If anything, it's where secrets go to hide." "Then that's where I'm going," she said, tucking the journal back into her bag. Ethan shook his head. "You don't understand. Ravenswood isn't just another town. It's complicated, and if Maeve was involved with it..." He trailed off, his unease palpable. Lila met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "If Maeve thought it was important enough to write about, then it's important enough for me to find out. You can either help me, or you can stay here. But I'm not stopping." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression a mix of frustration and admiration. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his rain-soaked hair. "You always were stubborn, and you always were infuriating," she replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips despite the weight of the moment. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the far end of the bridge. "If you're going to Ravenswood, you'll need someone who knows the way, and someone who can watch your back." Lila hesitated, but only for a moment. She didn't trust Ethan, not entirely, but she couldn't ignore the truth in his words. "Fine, but if you slow me down, I'm leaving you behind." "Fair enough," he said, falling in a step beside her. Together, they crossed the bridge, the rain washing away the sharp edges of their pain, but not its weight. As they neared the other side, Lila felt the faint stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Whatever awaited them in Ravenswood, it would bring answers, or more questions. Either way, Lila was no longer walking alone.